So now we'll get into disassembling the pistol. I'll be working on a Hammerli 480K that was converted. This is the adapter that the cylinder screws into. And it's not essential sort of for mechanical access, but it's easier to see what's going on if you remove the grip, and that takes a 2.5mm hex key, and there's just the one screw on the 480K, and then the grip just slides off. And before going any further, it's a good idea to make some marks and notes. For access, it's good to remove the trigger, and if you want to put that back in the same location, you can take the fine tip marker and put marks on the trigger bar. It's important on these to get the trigger in the same position, partly because presumably you have it set to your liking, but also because the trigger pull, because of the way the trigger is mounted on a lever, if you change the trigger position, it can affect the trigger pull. So you just loosen up the screw slightly, clamping screw, and then slide it off. And the next thing that you want to do is to make a note of where the bushing is located. You can see that the two pinholes for the spanner are at about 1 o'clock and 7 o'clock, and I'm going to mark around the top hole as a reference. And I'm also going to take my pad of paper and make a little drawing that shows where those holes are located. So, and I'll mark it as 1 o'clock. And it's also important, if you take a look at the back, this black spot is the back end of the piston, and it's helpful to make a note of where the back end of the piston is relative to the bushing, whether it's recessed or flush or sticking up slightly. And in this case, it looks like it's maybe 1/4 millimeter recess, so I'll make a note of that. The thread is 1 millimeter pitch, so if you've got the timing right, you'll be able to get the bushing back in the same location. The position of the piston just sort of helps to make sure it's right. So we've got our notes, things are marked, and this is where the miniature pin spanner comes in. And the back of the way the pins are made is with a U-shaped piece of spring wire, and so you can see from the back what the angular orientation of the pins are to make sure that you're getting them into the hole easily. And then you just unscrew it, and it doesn't take a ton of force. And once it backs out a ways, the tool will frequently want to fall out, but at that point you can usually take a toothpick and stir it to unscrew the rest of the way. And once it's completely loose, then you can just drop it out. So there's the bushing with the marks. And inside there's the spring, and fishing that out can, depending upon the pistol, sometimes they'll just fall out, but particularly if the X-ring has disintegrated, there may be pieces of the X-ring kind of jamming things up. In this case, it came out pretty easily. And to get the actual piston out, you can pop that out with a toothpick through the hole that the regulator pin goes into. And that's sort of most of the disassembly process. This one actually looks to be in pretty good shape. The symptom on this pistol, it was originally set aside with a tag indicating it had a slow leak. I tested that, and that didn't seem to be a problem, but I measured the velocity, and it varied a lot more than it typically should. The last step of disassembly is to try to get the quad ring off the piston, and depending upon how stiff it is, that can be a bit of a battle. The idea is to try to use a toothpick to get underneath it without stabbing yourself, and this one looks like it's going to work okay. And then you can pry the quad ring off. Some of the quad rings are a lot harder than others, either because they were a harder material to start with, or they've fossilized over time, and they can be a real battle to get off. A fix for that is you want to clean the internal parts with acetone, and it turns out that the O-rings, the X-rings the rubber doesn't like acetone, and if you have trouble getting it off, if you soak it in acetone, it'll swell, and it also seems to get more brittle, and it's much easier with it swollen to get the toothpick underneath it, and it'll usually snap in the process of trying to pry it off. So just to sort of start the cleaning process, I'll put everything into the acetone, and we'll get into the details of cleaning in the next video. So the next step is to clean everything. We put the internal parts into some acetone to soak, and now we'll work on the pistol. Depending upon sort of how gunked up it is internally, you may or may not have to use solvents, but to get inside, this is one of the standard length swabs, and it's a little long to sort of maneuver easily, which is where the flush cutters come in handy. And I just chop off about 3/4 of an inch off the back of a swab, and that allows me to get it in. And there's sort of 3 different sections as you move forward into the mechanism. There's the threads that the adjustment bushing goes into, and then there's sort of a cylindrical section where the spring is located, and then all the way forward is where the piston is, and this isn't too bad. There's a little bit of grime coming out. And then all the way in is the cylinder area where the piston and the seal operate, and that's where it's particularly important to get things clean. And if the quad ring X-ring has really disintegrated, frequently you will find little shreds or particles of the failed X-ring down inside, and you want to make sure you get all of that cleaned out. So I usually start with a couple of swabs to just get as much of the sort of coarse stuff and lubricant out. And then I use the spray solvent and basically wet one of the swabs and then run that around inside. And this one is actually in pretty clean condition. And to see how you're doing, you can look with the flashlight down inside. It's kind of hard to do with the camera, but you can see down inside the piston area and look for any lumps of fossilized grease or bits of quad ring down inside. Then we can go back to the internal parts that have been soaking in acetone and use the tweezers to fish those out. And because the acetone will attack the rubber material of the X-ring seal, you want to make sure that you clean these off carefully. And I use the duster to dry them. And usually it leaves the marker on there. This seems to have taken the marker off, but that's why having the piston location recorded is useful. So that's dried off. Basically, you want to make sure that all of the acetone has evaporated before you start putting things back together again. So that completes the cleaning process.